Um, we're just past the 11th anniversary of an event that I think changed the world. It was maybe the beginning of a new world order, but it maybe also spelled out the crisis of the skyscraper as an icon of power, like nothing had before. It made us understand that sometimes the disappearance of architecture can be more significant in its effects than its actual presence. And in that way, it might also question the very things we do as architects. And maybe it had to make us rethink what the role of architecture is and what the values are that it stands for, that it should stand for, and that it should embody. And if the things we do are always the right one. Then also, if we look at the context, was actually a context of an economic crisis, connected to the event or not, but certainly existing in parallel, that affected the world. If we look at now, we are actually in a very similar, in the aftermath, or still somewhat in the middle of a very similar moment of seeing parts of our economic system unravel and maybe question the very things that a lot of the high buildings we built are based on. It even went so far that the architecture critics decided that architecture altogether had to change, that the icon was over, and proclaimed the death of the icon in its last breath as a representation of architectural exuberance in stages of economic exuberance. Only Hollywood was even better. At the same time, they announced for this year that not only architecture would disappear in either tsunamis, tornadoes, or earthquake, but basically civilization as a whole. And maybe once again we realize that whatever we do might last slightly less long than sometimes we intend. But obviously, what is it to build a building? What is it to build a skyscraper? And what is it to build a landmark today in contexts that we are working in, and maybe also particularly in Asia? If architecture is really a shape and an object, we would all agree it shouldn't be. Is the city really a kind of random collection of more or less frivolous fantasies? We might all object, but nonetheless, if we look at what is happening, sometimes we might ask ourselves if, although we all talk about it, we're all really aware of its issues and its answers. Then, also about 10 years ago, was as well a significant moment in the history of the tall building, as Asia had, if you like, more successfully adopted the skyscraper as its own triumphant symbol of modernization, and suddenly started to build more and taller than the West. And this is a decade that we've now become used to it, but also a decade that maybe indeed has posed the question of what a skyscraper could be at this point in time, and how we might rethink or redefine a typology about 100 years after its actual birth and invention. The project that you might know best is a project that in a way took a very strong position in precisely that context. When we came to Beijing exactly 10 years ago, actually in April 2002, the city planners presented this image of the CBD at a point in time when only 3 of these towers existed, and said, the only thing we know about the future is that the future is about the skyscraper. So how to build in a context that promises nothing but verticality? We obviously asked ourselves if the issue of verticality could really be it in itself, if building the tallest building would be of particular interest, and thought it might not, because as you can very well follow in the proceedings of this Congress over the decades, every time you come back, there's anyway another taller building. So we said the legitimization of the skyscraper can no longer lie in its height. But what else could it be, and how could we think of or rethink verticality and maybe manipulate verticality to no longer be an expression of hierarchy or power in its tallest, where the top is the best and always most exciting, and the bottom maybe the least. And we decided to take the verticality and bend it back into itself, into a loop that would suddenly become a three-dimensional object, engage space and define space rather than absorb space in the form of a needle, but that would also proclaim an inner organization of a building as its very structure and very basis. The idea of a loop of interconnected activities, of the way that a process of collaboration inside a building, a non-hierarchical expression of a system with no beginning and no end, could form the basis for a very different building and a very different skyscraper. The building is the headquarters for China's national broadcaster, CCTV, and with that contains not only all processes of media production in a single building, but really the idea that the community of the staff of 15,000 people that will populate this building would coexist in this circular and interconnected space. I think this is still, in a way, one of the most interesting or exciting images, because it simply suggests in a very intuitive way to look at a building maybe not simply as a building, but almost as an organism. If you remember your biology classes at school and you see those open bodies with organs and circulatory systems, and to simply start to think of a building not as a generic mass, but indeed as a highly specific life form in itself. And as you dissect this life form, you see the enormous also technical specificity that is embedded in this building. But if then you start to reassemble those parts, you can actually identify that it's a system consisting of a series of primary technical clusters for broadcasting, program production, and news, that are interwoven and intertwined with a series of social and communal systems. Canteens, restaurants, cafeterias, chat rooms, meeting rooms, etc. And to comprehend the building indeed as a hybrid of those two that then is threaded together by the loop and circular circulation system indeed of the building. But as I said, a building and these buildings that we build, they become bigger and bigger, and I thought it was incredibly important to understand what that scale really means. So with our students, we cut 12,000 little sticks and glued them on our model, simply to understand what does it mean, a population like that, what does a number like that mean. We deal increasingly with bigger and bigger numbers, but I'm not sure that we're always aware, sometimes in purely physical terms, what these numbers imply. And the idea was obviously to think that this building is indeed a collective in its own right and almost has a public in its own right, with this number of people of extremely diverse backgrounds and professions that will occupy the building. We did the entire interior fit-out for almost 5,000 spaces, and in order to again comprehend what we were doing, we created a series of characters and followed these characters on their trajectories through the building as they would use the building, which spaces they would frequent, which paths they would follow, where they would meet, how they would interact, to again start to construct the project as a space of social interaction. These are, by the way, images of an exhibition I did with the Museum of Modern Art in New York and Beijing, which was again part of an effort to indeed communicate those intentions and aspects of the building. But we also went to our client and said it's actually quite a unique situation and a unique possibility we have with this building that for the first time in history really brings the process of media making together. And why don't we open this part up to the public and really offer if you like, an almost educational experience in terms of media making in real space inside a structure, but how would we also reveal the architecturally exciting aspects of this project? These are a few images of the now completed building of the main lobby On basement 3, a direct connection to the subway built simultaneously next to the building, and these escalators that project you up to the elevator lobbies, views of canteens in the building, office spaces, and the main broadcast control room, which is actually double-sided. You only see a single half of this, large enough to control the broadcasting of 300 TV channels simultaneously. But obviously, it's no longer the top of the building that is the most exciting, but it's simply its most projecting and cantilevering bit. It's the tip of the overhang that cantilevers out, and also this part is actually open, going to be open to the public in a visitor's loop, as we call it. And you can see these 3 little circles at the bottom, at the tip of the overhang, and these are in this space, and from here you can stand 180 meters above the ground and watch Beijing pass by slowly below you. And it's maybe one of the very interesting moments in this building is when you stand on this glass floor and you look down and you see a tower that stands next to you, although you're actually standing on top of it. So this kind of shift of reality and shift of perspective and space, certainly one of the aspects that are quite unique to this project in itself. The building is now completed. It has fulfilled its first really full mission and broadcast live the Olympic Games in London to China, and has now started to operate after basically exactly a decade after it had been first conceived. It has become somewhat part of the city in sometimes strangely harmonious and strangely contrasting ways that still show what it means to be a country that undergoes such dramatic development and modernization at such a rapid pace. It obviously has become a reference point in many ways in the city and started to change the landscape around it in a way beyond itself. Suddenly, from the middle of the past decade, 2005 onwards, all surrounding developments started to simply advertise with the proximity to the tower. Buildings that are almost smaller sort of present themselves as double the size. Even residential developments out of town, you can still see it luring over the horizon. And you realize that a project at this point has sort of left the realms of its own existence and gone somewhere else. It's even here, right next to us in Pudong. So some people had fantasies to bring it further. Artists had even better ideas than us, but we could never build this at the time. Maybe soon, with all the expertise in this room, we might get there. It also became a wedding cake engineered by a bakery, not by structural engineers. And finally, in a way, assumed a role as, I would say, maybe almost a character in a city. And I like this image very much because it really makes us think that buildings could maybe be more than buildings and indeed play a role as a character, as part of a larger story. Maybe its most important moment ever was this, when it suddenly appeared in The Simpsons at a contest for the biggest icon of the world, but we lost to Taj Mahal. This was an image this was in the first days of the competition, actually, or right after the competition. We were building a glass model, a plexiglass model in a sweatshop in Beijing, because the model we had submitted to the competition was cast in solid plaster. And the client came back to us and said, like, are you really proposing a concrete building with no windows? So we had to rectify that misunderstanding very swiftly. But on the left side, I think you see, in a way, the point of the building. That was not about being tall. That was not about having any reference as such to anything, but that simply because of its unique rethinking of how a building works and what the inner organization of the building implies to the outer shape, would assume an identity that would manifest itself in a very different way in all kinds of contexts themselves. And if you look at CCTV, it's on your here, sort of on your lineup. Maybe it's also, I think actually what the greatest achievement for me is of this building is that it's a huge building that looks tiny. If I look at most of the buildings that are being designed now, everybody tries to make their building look bigger and taller, and 2/3 of the building are inhabited, the rest is a scaffolding on top. Buildings are stretched out and made huge and bigger and more imposing. Actually, what I think is the biggest achievement of this is, although it's one of the largest buildings ever built, still until today in the world, when you come to Beijing, you will realize it's actually surprisingly small. And if you look at what would happen if I unfold this building, it would actually be over 700 meters tall with a floor plate of almost 2,500 square meters. So you realize how big this building is and how small we made it. And I think maybe if we're talking about resources or if we're talking about many things, sometimes smallness could also be a very attractive thing and not only tallness and bigness. A second project I want to present, a very different one, but also a question of what we could do with the skyscraper, and in this case with the skyscraper in a very particular context. This building I designed stands in Kuala Lumpur and actually stands next to the icon. So it's not the icon itself. So it was really a completely different question. The question was, how can you actually build next to a building, or actually a pair of buildings that have not only been the tallest of the world in the late 90s, but that also gave an enormous identity and pride to a country. However, a building that clearly stands of an era and a period where it was the power icon as the most important statement of architecture. And the question was, how could we be a neighbor to this? And how could we suggest very different qualities and ambitions of architecture next to those of power and dominance? The client actually asked me to design 2 towers. One was for them, one was for a different owner. But the first problem was that the site is actually so small that you can't fit 2 towers. The site is tiny. We're working with a plot ratio of 12:14, which, as you know, is a relatively high ratio, especially for the fact that we have 4 independent programs in the project: retail, hotel, residences, and offices, each with their independent access, etc. So most of you know what that means. But the site was simply not big enough for 2. But then I also said, like, well, to do a mini twin next to a maxi twin is maybe not a good idea. On the other hand, to do a single building next to all the other single buildings there is maybe also not such an interesting idea. And especially it doesn't give you the opportunity to create separate identities for the separate components of the building, and especially the ones that you might not own versus the ones that you own. The idea was to make a building that would not be a building, but actually a kind of assemblage of many pieces that would not be singular and not dual, but that would be multiple, and that would, in a way, somewhat resonate with a sense of the cultural multiplicity of its context. I think one of the really beautiful things and interesting things about Malaysia is I think you could say, looking at the world as a whole, the rather harmonious coexistence of many different cultures and religions within this country. So the idea that you could have a system that is somewhat a delicate balance of a few things that all interplay, need each other, yet have distinct identities, became the initial thought. But there was also a very, and you see how those shifting pieces and the balancing act, in a way, of those parts stand. But there was also a very pragmatic thought to it, namely, we have those different program components, and why don't we give each one of them their own volume, the residences, the offices, the hotel, and then we slice in between all the amenities, public programs, retail, parking, everything urban we need, and create a tower that suddenly sort of is very different to what is around, and yet at the same time very contextual in the way it can create relationships volumetrically and urbanistically to its surroundings. The three main building volumes in a way float and hover above those horizontal layers that in themselves are completely open and start to absorb the tropical city, the city that can enter into the building, into those layers, and where we can create a real mix of things. And the idea was to take the street and continue the elements of the street into the building. Usually buildings try to separate things. The cars go into the parking, the retail goes into this part, and that creates fairly inert and hermetic conditions at the base of buildings. Huge blocks of a retail thing that is enclosed or a parking garage. And here I wanted to continue the rather vibrant and exciting mix of the city. So I took the retail, the people, the green, and the cars, and started with a pedestrian spiral that would, with a large staircase, bring the sidewalk up into the building, even catapult people up 10 floors above the ground, and then bring a second spiral, like a double helix in for the cars that would intertwine, bring all the green and gardens to that, and have a system that in a very open way would be a continuation of the public trajectory of the city. And if you look into that, it's a real mixing and melting pot of this multicultural city. We have at the top swimming pools, gardens, we have a Chinese food court, we have Muslim prayer rooms, we have parking, we have shopping. And for example, to put the Muslim prayer rooms that usually end up in janitor closets of buildings in a way rather disrespectful, we said, why don't we celebrate all the cultures that are here and give them a dignified space in this mix of things inside the building. And as you move through it, you can see cars drive by, people walk past, you can see the city outside. There's continuously a connection of the urban realities that work so well in the city. Part of this public activity is raised up into the sky and lifted towards the intersection of the three volumes, and also here made accessible to the public the views to the skyline, where at some point you simply don't sell the building that you occupy, but maybe also the neighbors that provide stunning views from what you design. The openness of these layers allows us to bring in large amounts of green and gardens, and they are not simply furry edges or visual decoration, but actually accessible spaces and gardens for the occupants. And if we add all this up, we end up with almost 90% of green of the site area for a site with a plot ratio of 12:14, which I think in itself, again, explains the interest of the system. Further, shading is very important in the tropics. Obviously, sun, the most important factor to control in terms of energy. And I thought if sun is the problem, always when you're in a room and you step outside and it's really bright, like these lights, what you do is sort of this, you can see much clearer. And then I thought, why don't we give each window its own little kind of hand shield and develop a texture out of it that then we orient according to the orientation of the sun movements and optimize the shading of the building, but also give the building a texture beyond that of inert glass curtain walls that would really articulate the building. In the top of the tower, an atrium in the residential space that has huge windows that punch to the facades to bring daylight in, but that will actually also be a naturally ventilated atrium. And simply through the air circulation inside, we'll be able to achieve 4 to 5 degrees cooler air together with placement of water bodies, etc., than the outside. So we're reducing air conditioning loads and other things. And in the end, you can see how the building stands in its context and against its context. This is a view from the Petrona Sky Bridge to the building and how the building itself would manifest this balance and both, I think, a somewhat respectful relationship with its neighbors, however, the proclamation of very different architectural intentions and qualities. At the very end, very briefly, a project that I still like very much. Maybe the greatest towers of all was Babel. And maybe the greatest thing about it was that it was never finished. It is the idea of architecture as an ongoing process of negotiation of humankind. It is maybe also the symbol of us sometimes thinking beyond our limits. But I thought this sense of a building that was never finished and that was marked by the occupancy of the people that inhabited was the most beautiful idea for a tower. The building is in Bangkok. Bangkok is a city in a very interesting limbo between future and past, between roughness and gentleness, between the most incomprehensible buildings that arrive in a very traditional context. And if you look at Bangkok, it's actually a city that probably has the craziest buildings of all cities. It has a robot, a pyramid, an elephant, UFOs, extrusions, these Louis XIV chateau-like vertical monsters. And how could you do anything there that would be any different? And I thought the most interesting would be to do nothing and just extrude a square shape as a tower. But obviously the problem with the tower is that it is totally disconnected from the city. It says nothing about the life of the people inside. It is a scale that is mute as a totem and has no connection to the smaller grain of the human inhabitation. So I thought, what if we take this tower and erode it and take out and kind of leave it in a process as if it was never finished or as if it was already decaying. And this kind of smaller scale of the pixels, you can see how the surrounding texture of the partly still historical city kind of climbs up into the tower, and how the sense of incompleteness in a way marks the building as something that is not only a kind of visual projection of those fantasies, but indeed provides actual space for inhabitation. You see, these are all terraces and balconies of the inhabitants. It's usable space, and it will be the occupants that ultimately animate and activate this building, and their activity will be the image that is projected back into the city. As the tower reaches the ground, it doesn't come down in a hermetic block, but actually in soft cascading terraces with gardens, restaurants, and cafes. Again, a public space that transitions from the harsh urban environment into a more tropical nature zone that simply takes the city into the building, doesn't repel it at a solid base, with the sense that really this activity is climbing up and continuing up the tower, and the very top of the tower that we're keeping free of any equipment, and we believe will be one of the tallest open, completely 360-degree open sky decks accessible to the public. But also at the bottom we're creating a large public space, of which there are not so many in the city, equipped with a huge stage tower with things to stage public activity, but even with the fantasy that sometimes things could happen at places beyond the intentions of architects. It's connected to the SkyTrain, really a central square in the CBD of Bangkok, and a few views, obviously, of floating in the sky with the pixels and the sense of the tower that maybe never finishes. Thank you.